Conversation very well, prompting some very good questions. This was created. Yes, by students at Penn. Okay, so this is a real thing. I like it. As you may or may not know, James Corner was the long-time chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture at Penn, and actually he and Charles Walheim at University of Toronto are the ones that did the heavy lifting, creating a theory about landscape urbanism. But anyway, the Penn students created this. So this is the bullshit generator. Now, what they were making fun of is that a part of their work in the theory comes from literary theory. So the more you know about literary theory, the more you'll understand landscape urbanism, particularly Corner's take on it. But you make up words all the time in literature. So you have to learn sort of the language. So they got the make bullshit button. Let's see if it works. Ex-urbanized regional basins. Capture geographic peripheries. Architect robust operations. Rectify regional initiatives. Believe it or not, people use these words all the time. And this is random. They've got this whole thing that just kind of puts together crazy words just as sort of sticking their thumb in the nose of the folks. The thing to be mindful of, and the question out there regarding all of this is it urbanism? Or is it just pretty parks? Which are a part of urbanism, but not urbanism. All right, so let's deal with that. There's urban, there's urbanization, right? And there's urbanism. Urban, right? There are different ways of defining it. If you ask an ecologist, they're looking at the impacts on natural systems. So an urban area, to someone looking at the world, they're looking at rooftops, and they're looking at paved areas, they're looking at sewer systems, they're looking at roadways, and they're looking at utilities. They haven't talked about anything that we really care about in terms of urban, right? They've just talked about the human developmental impact on the land. Urbanization is the growth of that, spurred by human population growth, the spread of all of that infrastructure, essentially, that we need to survive. Urbanism is different. Urbanism is about how we compose our places to sustain urban life. It's more philosophical than anything else. I have a colleague at Michigan, Doug Kelbaugh, who teaches urban design, who suggests that there are 3 urbanisms. I actually think this is true. There's a traditional urbanism, which has been recaptured for suburban growth as new urbanism. What that says is that there's a pattern by which we have been developing human settlements for thousands and thousands of years. There are rules to this game. Since World War II, we've had enough technology and energy and infrastructure to subvert some of those rules, become auto-dependent, become spread out and low density, but for most of human history, we didn't live that way, right? So our problem with urbanization is not that we need a new urbanism. Our problem with urbanization is we have amnesia. If you delete the last 50 years, we're just fine. Go back to the old rules. Second category, Kelbaugh calls post-urbanism, right? Post, meaning after. Landscape urbanism fits in post-urbanism. Saying that, no, the rules are different now. We didn't have the internet and networks and information technology. We weren't able to make transatlantic flights. Most of your life, and your life was very short for most of human history. You died at about 45. Right? Women and men had specific gender roles adapted based on where they were culturally. All of that is completely inverted. Why are we following those old rules? The first ones to be bold enough to propose a post-urbanism were the international modernists, the rational planners, right, who started to subdivide cities based on zoning and codes instead of form, with the best of intentions, right? So here's a story about zoning. The reason why we have zoning is because as much as we romanticize traditional urbanism, it was putting harmful and noxious uses right next to each other. So for example, you build a small town or a village around a paper mill. That paper mill is poisoning the water. Everybody's getting their water from that paper mill. Because of the cultural affinity with that old mill village and that mill town, you're actually putting people in harm's way. Put the noxious uses further away, protect human health. A lot of this came out of public health crisis and issues in London in particular. Right? How to deal with issues of cholera and black plague and things of that nature. Yeah. So this idea of rational planning, right, with the best of intentions, was to protect human health and welfare and well-being. But after 50 years of rational planning extending beyond urban form, we find ourselves in suburban situations, although dependency in a lot of different things, driven by policy. But post-urbanism, that's the big thing, is that no, those last based on how you count, 3,000 to 6,000 years of human settlement in cities, that's out the window. We got new issues, so we need new ways of approaching it. The third one, which we'll get to after fall break, is called everyday urbanism. And I haven't shown a lot of work in Ghana, but it fits in this category. The term is coined by Margaret Crawford at the time she was at Harvard University. And what she spends her time talking about is building an urbanism based on the observed patterns of behavior in the places where you're working. So instead of a top-down model, it's a bottom-up grassroots model. So there probably isn't a pure one, but it's hard for me to find alternatives to these three. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because landscape urbanism fits under post-urbanism. It says, no, the rules have changed. And based on the article Drawscape, Alan Berger, who's at MIT now, gave a lecture here a couple years ago that was very confusing, so I didn't give it to you, says that the culprit, we've inherited a lot of the negative things that have happened under what we call traditional urbanism. Well, let's start with the project that they all agree with. Yeah, go ahead.
Say the name of the paper that you said was too confusing.
Alan Berger.
Alan Berger.
Yes, so in this week's readings, I think there's a reading from Drawscape. He was the author of that, and we'll talk about that briefly in the lecture. Okay, so there are a couple of precedents to landscape urbanism, but this question of park, is it a park or is it an urbanism? This is the Emerald Necklace in Boston. How many people have been to Boston? If you're not spending the rest of your life in this country, you gotta go to Boston. Not only is it the home of some really great urbanism, traditional urbanism. For example, the north end of Boston is one of the great urban places in our whole country. But it's also the home of some of the really early works of landscape architecture, particularly Frederick Olmsted. To go beyond just a park or a street or an individual site, but to create a huge system that defines parts of the city. So this Emerald Necklace was formed by connecting Boston Common all the way down to Back Bay as a public health project. Right? People were concerned about flooding, people were concerned about disease, because at that time, malaria was an issue, and there were other issues with low-lying areas and being close to those. So organizing a citywide open space system to literally restructure the city is seen as a precedent to landscape urbanism. Operates. The word operate is going to come up a few times at a citywide scale. And if you go to Boston, it still functions extremely well, right? So, Newberry Street, in these long green fingers written about by Anne Spurn and Granite Garden and many other places, talk about the beginnings of our understandings of ecosystem services and how all of this green actually benefits the life of the city. These huge continuous city-defining systems. In field operations' latest work, this is the Seattle Waterfront project. You can see him borrowing from Olmsted. So as much as they were trying to be divergent and separate from ideas of traditional urbanism and traditional space, they are converging again. We'll touch this again at the end of this lecture. So what this shows is that he was hired, field operations was hired to look at the waterfront, which is here, this inner ring. What they discovered was that there was an incomplete Olmsted Brothers plan of linked parks in the upper areas of Seattle, and identified strategic streets that link the riverfront and the waterfront to that ring of parks. So this is typical of a designer. If you want more budget, more time, more influence, you gave me that, and I'm going to find a reason for you to give me all of that. Right? That's Olmstedian in scope. Right? We're not just looking at the waterfront, but we're looking at how it's connected to these neighborhood parks and to these streets. This convergence I find interesting because early, the aesthetic of landscape urbanism was really its greatest strength. The underlying rules of the game by which they created forms and aesthetics was radically different than your pastoral park, right? But it's coming back around to more traditional urbanism. But let's get back to it. If you tell an architect that, really what defines a city is not the buildings at all, it's the open space, they'll laugh you out of the room. They think you're crazy. This map is a part of the Noli map of Rome. It's figured out. This one is based in London, but it's a pattern after the Noli map, which includes built form and informal built spaces to show the grain of the city. This is usually how we think about cities. So if you're dealing with urban design, this is one of the quick models that's used. There's lots of different examples of them, right? So this one is Chicago. And you can read a lot into the urban form of a place just looking at the building footprints and what's happening. Now, you don't see a lot, right? The void is all the landscape. And that's only what's visible at the surface. And you have no idea about the underlying factors that form that landscape, right? And those are all things that are really critical to making strategic landscape moves. These renderings talk about the perception of urbanism and views of the city at a time of crisis. I argue we're kind of in the same boat. There's some people who sort of romanticize the city, the urban form of the city, which is visible on the left, right? The great tall towers, prosperity, wealth, power, control, prospect, right? But there's some that are down in the dumps, dealing with all the outcomes, the negative outcomes of city living. These exist in the same space. One thing that happened, and a big up to Detroit, my hometown, what's interesting is that Charles Waldheim himself developed some of his initial thinking about landscape urbanism based on his experience practicing as an architect in Detroit. And before Toronto's regeneration, it was very similar to Detroit. Big, flat, sprawled out all over the Peninsula City, just on the Canadian side instead of the west side. But Henry Ford, okay, so about Henry Ford, did not invent mass production, did not invent the automobile, but perfected it. So the Rouge plant, which is right outside the city of Detroit, at the time was the largest factory on planet Earth. It was the only factory we brought raw materials in one side by boat from the water and outrode cars. And everything that they didn't use got recycled back into the plant. They made rubber in there, they made metal, they made glass, they made everything that was required for the car. They didn't outsource or spill out anything. Right? So, Gene Bressler is from Long Island, right? And he's from a really influential community called Levittown. So Robert Levitt, after World War II, took the mass production model, applied it to communities and housing, which is to say, you could, just like when you order a car, like surround sound, leather bucket seats, and windshield wipers that are red, for the first time in human history, you could order from a catalog at like blue washing machines, not like pink drapes, and not like a king-size bed, not like a white roof in a garden. And they would train it and truck it in and assemble it for you. It made development and urbanism a mass production consumable product. This didn't happen before World War II for many reasons. It was in our country. After World War II, marrying mass production with urbanism and dwelling was the bullet that led to this post-urbanism thinking. So it's known as Fordism, okay? Which is why its name is in there. Now, in his attitude, what he revolutionized as well, which you talk about in Detroit, is also a lesson for a lot of other parts of the world. What made the Model T a revolutionary car is that because of the efficiencies in manufacture, it was affordable to the employees. So all the employees of Ford became consumers of Ford, and that money stayed in the system. So when you look at other parts of the world that are lifting themselves out of poverty based on industry, they've all studied Henry Ford. And in a certain extent, their approach to urbanism, this mass production of affordable living based on the tools at hand, is an outgrowth of this as well. What Alan Berger talks about in very obscure diagrams and in personal language, in Dross state, and Dross is a German term for waste, right? Dross. So he proposed that there's actually a Dross scape, there's a waste landscape. What is the waste landscape? They're all the forgotten spaces that come from urbanization. So when we talk about urban, we have that romantic image like we saw on the left in that previous slide in New York, right? When y'all are doing urban design, you're not thinking about sewers, you're not thinking about slums, you're not thinking about where the food's coming from, you're not thinking about how materials are being brought out and waste is being taken out. We don't think about that in the urban environment. We're usually thinking about the space, right? What Berger talks about is that that's really the most insignificant component of urbanism. He starts to map using these diagrams, and you'll see a lot of people in landscape urbanism exploring this tool. This is also an innovation from Jim Corner. He had a very influential book called Taking Measures Over the American Landscape, where he started to introduce collage as a method of communicating landscape values, quantitative information. So at the same time you see the graph, you also see an image that references the character of the place and a lot of other things. This is one of his innovations. Taking measures of the American landscape. I'll put some slides in the last story. What this graph is showing is a graph of GDP in billions US dollars from 1950 to 2000. Right? What this is showing is the decline of manufacturing. The same diagram. So as we are making more money and becoming richer, we are not really technically making anything. And so all of these spaces where we used to make stuff are now waste landscapes. This is showing population density on top in our country. And on the bottom, it's showing urbanized area. So, interestingly enough, the United States over the last 50 years has gotten much less dense and has consumed much more urban land. Urbanization, infrastructure, roads, utilities. So these parallel processes are happening in terms of how you think about urbanism. On one hand, we have more prosperity, more wealth, more population. On the other hand, we have much lower density. And yet we're consuming more land than we ever did. This is the situation that the landscape urbanists operate in. This is my hometown of Detroit. The darker the gray, the more vacant it is. 42% of my hometown is vacant. At its height, Detroit was 1.9 million people, 144 square miles. Today it is 675,000 people in the same area. The majority of that dark gray is manufacturing infrastructure, railroads, storage facilities, abandoned plants, and the neighborhoods that supported them. Just as a, we'll get to this part in a second. So just as a figure ground, right? So in terms of traditional urbanism and the kind of solutions that you proposed in our first model, this is a figure ground of downtown Detroit, 1 square mile in 1950, 1960, 1970, 1980. Right? So, North Carolina, it'd be interesting to note, half of our counties are growing, half of them are shrinking. Of our 100 counties, only 17 have urban centers that are worth counting. And of those, half of those are shrinking. So this is, what I'm trying to set up is the conditions within which landscape urbanism emerged. And with population loss, you also learn other things. You lose tax base, right? So you don't have the resources to commit to big infrastructure projects, right? And then you have a political climate, at least in our country, of resistance to national investment, particularly in infrastructure. American Society of Civil Engineers issues a survey every year of our infrastructure in this country. They estimate just to bring, they give it a grade, and our overall infrastructure, water, sewers, utilities, rates a D right now. In terms of condition, in terms of safety, in terms of just basic human health and welfare. They estimate it will take $1 trillion, that's with a T, dollars to bring it up to a C. Not even an A. So, and we don't have the political will to do that right now. So this is the sort of the political, social context and the leftovers of this industrial era of our country that led to this birth of landscape urbanism. And this is going to be an abbreviated thing. This could be a whole lot. Artists, in a certain way, led the way and inspired the initial landscape architects. So this is in Manhattan. This is Alan Sonfest's Time Landscape. This. So what happened is they put up a new residential tower in this neighborhood, new at the time, it was the 1970s, had in a vacant lot. He decided to just fence it off and allow old field succession to take over, and that was his art piece. So this idea that the unplanned, accidental relationships that happen in ecology and environment all the time could be seen as a thing of beauty and celebrated. Now, I actually went there about 4 years ago, spent some time there. Didn't work. So in terms of criticism, it was a great sort of thought experiment, but it turns out that people were kind of overwhelmed with the character of it. They didn't feel it was safe. They thought it was harboring rats. They did all kinds of stuff.
You could get into the site.
You can get in there. Yeah.
So they took the fence down.
They took the, well, they said they put up a wrought iron fence, said chain link, and they took out all the understory. So basically, you got canopy and pretty much bare earth underneath. So I'll share some pictures if people are interested. This is another one. This is Agnes Dennis, her wheat field, also in New York City, Twin Towers, still stood, 1982. So it gives you a sense of where you are. This is Battery Park, so when you're down near the southern border of Manhattan. Literally took a vacant lot and grew wheat on it. That was her art installation. But provoked, this juxtaposition of city versus natural process, provoked influential people to start to say, well, maybe we need to think about landscape in a different way, not try to make everything like Central Park. At the time of Central Park, and at the time of Frederick Olmsted, he admittedly knew nothing about ecology and environment at all. Neither did Calvin Fox. They knew a lot about form, they knew a lot about patterning after systems that they saw, but the underlying processes that led to them, next to nothing. We know a lot about ecology. Right? We know a lot about how systems operate and function. So this is an example of a sample stand in forest ecology to talk about the natural succession of this particular community, where tulip poplars are the king in that particular part. So we know a lot about that. To the point where we can start to, at that time, experiment to have chance and unpredictability and uncertainty be a part of the game, but slowly direct that system to the stable state that we want. Think about your landscape architecture project right now. You all are probably thinking about specifically where an individual tree should grow and what kind of species of plant should be in one place and where a path should go and where all these components can happen. Why? Because you have to do it in construction documents to give clear instructions to people who need to build it. Now, what if you thought about it in a totally different way? Right? What if you thought about it as introducing different situations on your site and managing those situations until they became something without a predicted outcome at the end? And you're more focused on process than you were on the end product. It's a very hard thing to wrap your brain around. We know a lot about biomimicry now, right? So when you look at state-of-the-art technologies, even on our own campus, biomedical technology, industrial design, other elements. This honeycomb, for example, I don't know how many people have used the MakerBots, but this pattern and this structure is very, very, very strong. So when you look at any kind of made object, right, it's some variation of this as the internal structure. It requires the least amount of material for the most part of strength.
What's the MakerBots? Sorry,
I'm sorry?
what is the MakerBot?
MakerBots. All right, so when you go to the IT lab, you'll see this little black box, about as big as my computer. You feed it strings of plastic, you introduce a 3D model, and it makes it for you, whatever it is. So there's a camera component on this that's broken. I told Wayne about it, and a day later they made one on their own, just with those instructions. You can make almost anything, right? They're making houses now with MakerBots. 3D printers, 3D printing, yeah. So biomimicry. Now this is really important. The bee doesn't know the whole system. The bee knows how to make that, and make that again, and make that again. This is known as a seed form that multiplies on its own to create the bigger structure. We're going to come back to that idea in a second. Lots of examples. My friend Christina Hill, who's now at Berkeley but was at Virginia, was at Washington this year, maybe 6 years ago, giving this presentation. So with all of that preamble, she summarized it like this, right? So how can this perform like that? What can we really learn from unplanned natural processes applied to our current living conditions? This is an example borrowed from C Streets, which is was really famous in Seattle. So it's a suburban neighborhood, just like any other neighborhood you find in Raleigh. So while a lot of people look at the houses, and they look at the yards, and look at other things, she's looking at sewers. So that's the sewer system for that picture that you just saw. We talk about the $1 trillion number, right, to replace all the sewers. In her mind, she saw all the landscape opportunity to outperform what we did in the sewer by mimicking natural systems and natural process. We know it now as these rain gardens and these storm gardens. This is 20 years ago. Which led to rethinking the street. So this is the street before, that's the street after. She has an interesting spreadsheet where she talks about it. So,
Is that Photoshop? That's not.
not Photoshop.
That's a real place.
That's a real place.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So everything that used to go in the sewer now goes in the street. So just like out here on Pullman, they had
Landscape architects like Olin, how they're